This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live with Jayne Wesler. That I got your last name right? Is that how I pronounce it?
Yes, sir. That's exactly right.
Okay, so this is the first time we've talked to you, and I hope you're having a good day or good enjoying. And I forgot to ask you, but we're in lovely Concord, New Hampshire. But we wanted to mention that we are on the Newsly platform as a featured podcast, and so we mentioned that if you our viewers use coupon code Ghost, they can get 1 month free premium subscription. Newsly is a platform that has they take video podcast and convert them to audio for Android and iOS devices. And so if you can stop scrolling and start listening. We're a featured podcast. This will be on Newsly within an hour. So again, thank you for being on the Phantom Electric Ghost Show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here. I'm very excited to meet with you and talk with you tonight. And that's an excellent offer for Newsly.
Yeah, it's cool to get sponsors as we've been I've been in the podcast area since 2016 and started getting sponsorships like maybe 2 years ago. But one of the things I was reading about your background is like you had a full-time law and you decided to become a writer. And I'm a musician, but I still have my day job as a technical person. Um, and a lot of artists we have, but like what we really want to do is I want to do music all the time or do podcasting all the time, but I hard time. So what made you go to take the dive into leaving that full-time gig and becoming a writer?
Phantom, it was a natural arc of my life for me. And I've had a number of transitions in my life already. I went from being a journalist to becoming a psychotherapist. And uh, I then decided to go back to school and become an attorney. And I worked at that for over 20 years, worked with kids who have learning challenges, kids with disabilities. And I it's not that I became a writer. I've always been a writer. It's something I was born with. And I think that uh, anybody has a talent. Everybody has a talent. It's something that we're born with. But we can be called to that talent. It's something that lives inside of us, that creativity. And I have always written in some form or another. And mm, people would often say to me how much my thoughts or words or cards or stories had touched them. And I knew that someday I would write a book or books. About mm, 15 years into my law practice, I was just really itching to write a book. And I had so many times I had scribbled down some notes or thoughts about a story or written a chapter, and then I just put it aside. And I promised myself, uh, I had a big birthday, and I said, the next idea I get, I am going to write into a book. I don't, whether it's good or bad, I'm just going to finish it. And so I did that. It was a little difficult while I was practicing law because there's something called a trial that we get involved with in litigation
Uh,
practice.
Too much
Most
prep work,
cases, it takes
a
a
lot of
lot of
work.
preparation, and then you're in court all day, and then you've got to prepare after court. So it was hard to stay creative because you're dog tired and your brain gets hammered. And so I actually wrote a novel. And I don't know if you're a fan of Stephen King or not, but he wrote a book called On Writing, and the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
half of it.
I grew up
Oh, so
reading that.
yeah, so what a great book, and it was so inspiring to me. So I was following his direction of, he writes a book and then he gives it to 6 of his trusted readers. So I did that too. I had my book bound at Staples
Mm.
and just gave it to people I knew and loved and trusted. And then I started writing the second book, and the first one took a long time because of all the delays and whatnot, because of the demand of the full-time
What was the
practice.
title of that first book?
Oh, it's so funny that you should ask. So the title of that first book, Phantom, was Riders on the Storm. Sound familiar as a musician?
Oh,
You
Jim
know the work
Morrison.
of the
Yeah, Jim
Doors.
Morrison, The Doors.
Absolutely, and it was
Yeah.
perfect. It was perfect. It was about
Oh,
a
you
100-year storm, a storm of unprecedented magnitude, uh, and how it changes people's lives and how it calls us to give more than maybe we thought we had, and so that was the name. Now, I didn't keep that name. I actually published that book uh, um, a year or two ago, and I had to change the name. I didn't even ask if I could use the name because I finally finished my
okay, you
second
figured they
novel.
would come after you.
Well, I wouldn't have published it without permission, and so while I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
practicing again, I started writing that second book, and ultimately I was just not able to finish it. I had to put it aside. So, and here's the transition part out of full-time legal practice. My husband and I had been planning for years about the next stage of our lives. Our kids were grown, they were having children, and he had retired from his position after 44 years, which was a long time. And a number of people in my family had died young, and so we really talked it out and decided life's too short, and it was time to make the move. We felt financially we had been preparing for many years, and we were able to do it. So we did, and I went to part-time status at my law firm, and it was time to write the book. So I actually wrote a couple of nonfiction books first to kind of get them out of my system, about my legal practice and representing kids with disabilities and a number of things. Um, and so then I published the Riders on the Storm, which no, actually, I published the second book first, which I I had called
Mhm.
Locomotive Breath. You know that title too, right?
Oh, wow.
Locomotive
That's
Breath.
another song. Yes, another song.
You know, I never thought I would be good at titling my books, but it just hit me one day out of the blue. You know that song? It's so evocative of a railroad,
Yeah,
a locomotive engine, and I thought it's perfect.
yeah.
The book is about a troubled teen who's suffering from depression and anxiety, and he's seeing other kids commit suicide, kill themselves. We don't say commit suicide anymore because it sounds like a sin or a crime or something.
Mm,
So I wanted to title it Locomotive Breath, and I sought
mm,
permission from Ian Scott Anderson. I found out the company that represented him, and he denied my request to use
yeah.
some of the lyrics on the flyleaf. And they also said to me,
Oh,
"And you can't call your book Locomotive Breath." And I thought, you can't copyright a title, but you can trademark it. And I looked it up, and he had trademarked it. So I
mm.
renamed that book Railroaded.
Oh, he trademarked it. Yeah, Jethro Tull. And when
Yes.
Jethro Tull was so big with that, that was one of their, like, besides Aqualung, that's like a big.
Hey,
Yeah,
Aqualung. Yeah, right.
I'm a child of the '70s, so
Me
yeah. So I
too. Me
mean, a
too.
lot of their work, I was always into his flute
Oh,
playing
yeah. Yeah.
rock. But
Yeah.
that's interesting that you have this. From what you've said, you have two titles that came from music, and I'm a big I'm all pushing music as like to me like life coaches like the Beatles were like the ultimate life coaches for
Mm.
almost every modern musician. Like they inspired a whole generation. So I find it really interesting when people pull things from into their work. I think it's kind of cool to cross pollinate things from like
Mhm.
with paintings or poetry or music crossing into other zones is kind of like what I do
Mhm.
as a producer. But I think
Other
that's
areas
just
of
aside an aside.
creativity.
I think so. Is that something you like to do? That you like to try to? I know some writers like to bring like song imagery into their work. Is that something that you actually do beyond the title?
I don't consciously do it, but it does seem to happen. Uh, and so, we're
Hmm.
thinking about creativity and what inspires us. And I think that everybody has some kind of creative spark. And you can almost always be creative, uh, unless you're in need of sleep, or you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, which those are human needs that we have to take care of, right? But uh, creativity is there, and you have to make yourself available to it. And one way that you can do that is through music. Music is like an arrow that you shoot into your heart, and it penetrates so immediately, so deeply. My husband was playing me a song the other day. He had been listening to some a piano piece, and I couldn't hear it very well, and I said, "What is that?" And he
Hmm.
started to play it for me, and I I I literally got goosebumps, and tears came into my eyes. That is the power of music. And I've used it in my therapy for sure.
Yeah, recalls like a way.
Sorry, there you go ahead, please. There was a little
Well,
delay.
music can kind of recall. Yeah, yeah, it recalls like cinematic or sound painting type of ideas, right?
Mhm.
So people, when they recall a song, they recall scenes. It recalls like moments that people associate these songs with, like parts of their life, like the soundtrack to their lives. So people like they
Absolutely.
had a song when they were falling in love. They have a song when somebody mourning somebody. They have songs when they're happy. And so when they comes on, because it's that powerful. That's how I always felt. I want to say one more thing about that. What Pete Townsend talked about, like he was at Woodstock with the Who, and he was working on this rock opera. He never got to finish, but it became a Who's Next. Was like there's a universal note that when you write a song and you connect with a large audience like that Woodstock audience, that you hit this universal key that somehow like people it communicates that the song like the waveforms and the just the actual idea of the music just like hits people. And I think that's like the creative kind of power that music has, because just hitting those frequencies can trigger people to have certain emotions.
That's really interesting. I'd love to see a study done on the human brain waves while people are listening to those exact notes. I bet someone has done a study on that. That is really fascinating, and I bet you that music has the power to heal. I really do believe that. It's something that I've written about in one of my books, and uh, I bet there's proof of it out there. So now you have me curious. But I bet too, as the audience is listening to this, and Phantom, you're talking about moments that uh, music helps us to recall. It just brings you right back there. And you made me think of the piece by Israel Kamakawiwo Ole. Am I getting his name right? You know that the Hawaiian guy
Mhm.
who he did
Mm.
the I haven't thought of this in
Mhm.
so long. He did that remake of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And the story of that is fascinating. You probably know
Oh,
it. He wanted to record that song, and his agent was a friend of the recording guy, and they called him at some early hour in the morning, at like 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they said, "Can we come over and record this right now?" And he let them come over, and they recorded it, I think, in one take.
yeah.
That song always brings tears to my eyes because it reminds me of my cousin Sam, who was a big teddy bear of a guy, just like Izzy, and he died young suddenly because he was overworking himself to provide for his family, and he
Mhm.
was just working this crazy shift and driving hours to go to work to make a lot of money for the family and provide for his wife and daughter, and along the way he became ill and died suddenly. And I will never forget the moment where my mom called to tell me that, and that song always brings me right back to that moment.
Mm,
And it's a bit of a sad story, but it's poignant, and again, it just illustrates the
mhm.
power of music.
Yeah, it's always been a big thing for me because as a songwriter and a producer, like I try to catch what I do a lot of stream of consciousness uh, written music. Like I'm into like free jazz and fusion, and a lot of what I'll do is like maybe I'll have something in my head or have something in my subconscious, and I just put my multi tracks on and I just play. I like to capture it because I was reading documentaries about old school recording, and like Elton John said, on the Yellow Brick Road, everything's like second, third take because they would just
Wow.
take the whole band and just record whatever they were doing. Very much into that style of recording because I think you capture the honesty as a musician. You
Mm.
don't overthink things. That you just let
That's
as a musician, we're kind of like we can channel things.
that's really
That's what we try
cool.
to channel. If you don't overthink it, you don't overcomplicate it.
And that way too, I think you're
I'm wondering, is that with writing? Do you
yes. Yes, I was actually thinking that's one of the things that you sparked me to think is, uh, so there's an exercise that writers sometimes get writer's block, or if they just want to generate ideas, they'll sit down and do a brainstorming, and this is where, and I guess you could do it on a keyboard, but it's also good to do with a pen and paper, and you just start writing. You don't stop at all.
Mhm,
You just think, and you write for 5 minutes, and even if at some point you don't know what to write, you say, I don't know what to write, but you keep writing, and that kind of clears out the sludge, and it helps you to open up that stream of creativity. And
mhm,
there was a time where I was really trying to get that first book done, which the first book was Locomotive Breath, and I was working so much, but I decided, listen, I've got to get this done. I'm alive now. I want to finish this. This is part of my life's work here. And so I got to the point where at 5 or 5:30 in the afternoon, I would put my legal work away. I would stay at my desk and I would start working on my manuscript. And there were times where the creativity just flowed like a stream, like a river. And I would actually almost have this out of body experience, as if I were watching myself typing, and the story was just coming out like a river. And that's kind of what you were describing. The thing
mhm.
I think that's really neat about that is that
Yeah,
when
but
you're being this your honest, open, authentic self is when you really connect with people, because we all need to touch authenticity, especially in the world today, the way things are. People crave that, I think.
yeah, because there's a lot of people like I'm kind of old school, and I like the idea of like poets just going to a jam session and just going, and just like didn't even they kind of not even going off their page. They just see what they can do, and I love artists, like painters that will do that. Very much been into that kind of mindset because I feel that when something you just trust yourself. Like if you're an artist, you know that you're an artist, right? You know how to play or you know how to paint or you know how to do. If you trust yourself and you kind of just feel, you have to like you feel the room, you feel what's inside you, you recognize what's going on around you, and all these inputs you just let. You don't if you just happen with your artistic sensibility, just go at it. And I heard like Dylan used to just take his typewriter And with the band, the band will be playing all this music, and then he would just go on the typewriter and just type all this stuff kind of out freeform. And a lot of that
Wow,
basement tape stuff with the band is really brilliant, because of the way he did it like that.
and the amazing thing about him is he didn't even understand that. He didn't know how brilliant that he was. He didn't seem to understand how or why he touched people that way, which is pretty interesting. But I think you're talking about the sweet spot. The first time I ever heard that phrase was when I went skiing, and I took lessons, and the instructor talked to us about the sweet spot, which when you ski is at the front of your boot, and you use that to steer yourself.
Mhm,
And it's a little bit counterintuitive in that realm, because you're flying down the face of a
mhm,
snowy mountain, and you wouldn't think that you're going to use your shins to steer. But when you get it and you feel it and you do it,
yeah,
it works. And that is what you're talking about, with all channels open, to just let that creativity flow. It's really cool. And it translates actually probably to so many things, but you made me think of the practice of law. So when I was in law school, I went to Seton Hall Law, which is in Newark, New Jersey. And as a third year student, you have the opportunity, if you work in a clinic at the school, to go to court under the supervision of a real attorney, under New Jersey Rule 121 3AB or something like that. And I had joined a clinic because I wanted to have that firsthand experience of actually representing people. And so the first week of law school, probably the second or third day of my third year, I went to court. And I had already had a career as a psychotherapist. So I was a little bit older than the average law student at that age, who was probably around 24. I go to court on behalf of this little boy whose father was in jail, never wanted anything to do with him before. But now that the father was in jail, he wanted to make the mother bring the kid to come see him. And it was a little boy. I'm talking 3 years old, maybe. And the mother didn't want the kid to be exposed to this, and especially to be used by the father. And so I was appointed to
mhm,
represent the child. And so I had to go into court and argue against the father. Was trying to force this child to have a psychological evaluation. And I went in, and I had all my notes. It was my first time. I was in a real courtroom in front of a judge. So I was ready. And I got up, and I had memorized the opening lines, because if you're a public speaker, that that's one trick to do, is that you memorize the first part and then you just go.
mhm.
Becomes natural because you're ready, really. So I did
Go
that,
with it.
and I
Yeah.
was arguing, and then at some point I became very incensed because the other side was arguing against the position, and I threw my papers down, and I then really just stepped into the role. And the judge later called up my
Mhm,
professor and said, I had a deputy attorney general in here later in the day, and he said, your student, if I didn't know the difference, I would have thought your student was the deputy attorney general, and that she was the student, because I had done such a good job at doing it. And that's because it
mhm.
was that thing that happened, that it was that sweet spot, that moment when everything started to come
You get
together. And so even
you get
in a
comfortable
profession,
in the role. I mean,
you
yeah,
feel the
you
room,
get
like you
like,
said.
I've been yeah, you gotta feel it. It's like when I talk to musicians, right? And if I meet musicians and we're kind of like in tune is, if I get one to jazz musicians, I don't have to tell them what key I'm in. I don't have to tell them what the chord changes are. If I start playing, the drummer knows exactly what to do, and I don't have to play with this. If I start doing order on a piano or on a Rhodes or something, they just know what to do. But when I run into people where it doesn't sync, they stop and they start and they're like, what key are we in? What the chord charts are. And then that's not so enjoyable that they
You're not speaking the
you
same language.
can't deal with it, but you're like comfortable. Everybody kind of, yeah. If everybody's more in tune, then that's when you get like a band. Like
Yes.
every they're a band is because they have that connection that they know
And
what to do.
you're
You know,
you are talking to each other. You're just not speaking in words. You're talking to each other with your music and your instruments.
yeah, yeah. It's like that's what musicians love it when if they can actually speak with their instrument and the other musicians to verbalize it. You know, and that usually is worth so much. It's hard to when I've interviewed musicians, they all acknowledge that they love that when those moments happen. You know, and during COVID, it was hard to get those moments when you're working remote with people. You just ended it, and you have to do it after the fact. When if you were all together, then you can kind of do it together. And some musicians are very much tied to being physically together to
Mhm.
write their work and not so much like I do a lot of stuff by myself, so I can't. You typically need to all be there to write, and so that's the kind of like it's cool when and I've had the opposite where I've just done everything myself, so it's just like a total like control freak situation, which I feel like you're building that universe and you're doing everything, right? Like if you're a producer, like a Prince type of producer, you did everything. So you're building that whole world by yourself with no other musicians. And it's a different task. And when
That's so right. It's a different task, and it's good that you can do both. And I think that being in the same room with the other musicians it would be really enjoyable. And you feel the energy in the room, and you just let it almost play on your own self, because I think we're all instruments in a way. People talk about playing on your heartstrings. Those are your emotions, and so we bring that
Mhm.
when we're musicians. We bring that into play. And if you're and there is energy. I mean, there's a lot of studies done about how when we're in physical proximity to people, uh, how our bodies react to other bodies with pheromones and chemicals and things like that. And so I got to think that with music and that energy, there's something that's happening there that's really cool. But I do have to applaud so many
There's like a
musicians.
chemistry. It's like
Yes. Yeah, it's chemistry. It's exactly what it is. But weren't you impressed? And I think you did it too, with all the musicians who during COVID were making Zoom and other kinds of recordings of themselves, or
yeah,
getting on Zoom.
I was one of
Uh,
those.
oh, that was so neat, and it was so uplifting to have musician. You go online, and or somebody would send it to you, and it just made you feel so much better about what was happening. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, we did a lot. Uh, we did a lot. We did we had a bunch of festivals where I had independent emerging artists do like 3-day festivals where we play from our bedroom studios as bedroom producers and did kind of unplugged moments where people could feel like real true kind of heart actually feel it, where people are so into perfect music today where they try to make everything sound, and I think they missed the boat where like a lot of the old school stuff, like the Jethro Tull stuff and other bands like Led Zeppelin and all the old '70s
Led
bands.
Zeppelin. I
It was
was
something about
thinking
the
let's.
magic. There's just the magic of playing like that chemistry of John Bonham and playing with John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page and there's this connection with those guys are so good that when they would come together, it was just this chemistry that it's unwritten language. I've heard like rehearsal tapes of them playing, and I'm like very excited about when they found things. And I always think that's so interesting, the discovery of like finding the groove that made the song.
Yes.
And when they actually find they get is just really cool to actually get behind that music and understand that structure. And I've always like understand like the behind like when you're writing. And I've heard a lot of writers they have this problem where they're like they got to complete it right. And some writers they never get to some ideas, they have to drop them because they can't finish it. And that's like the core of like being a successful writer is to actually be able to finish that novel and get it done so they could don't go and get kind of held hostage to their ideas and never finish it.
Well, that's kind of sad for someone who's probably quite talented, who writes most of a book and then can't finish it. And some people become blocked by something called imposter syndrome, where and it's a real syndrome. You can hear, you know, tapes, recordings, YouTube videos. There are books about it where you just become the artist, the writer, the musician, the person just doesn't believe in themselves, feels like they are actually being an imposter, pretending to be good at what they're doing, and then they get blocked up and they just don't finish it. Or maybe with a writer, these days, self publishing is the way to go because it's really difficult to get a publishing contract with a traditional house, a publisher. And
Yeah.
the publishing itself is quite daunting to actually take your book from a manuscript and make it into a published work and then market it. And so I think a lot of people get hampered by that as well. Uh, they get blocked by that. Uh, you talked about Led Zeppelin and you literally took the words out of my mouth. Uh,
Yeah.
because I was thinking about them. And what about just to fully flesh out that idea, uh, Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Moon
Oh,
and
Pink
that
Floyd.
album.
Oh, I was watching a documentary, and Pink Floyd mentioned in the documentary that they were all on the same page when they wrote that album. But what's really interesting when I watched the documentary is later they had personnel conflicts and they had issues. But when they've all finally realized that they got out of what they called psychedelic noodling and started writing structures that were kind of like Tommy and her, like they're right. It's like a rock opera, but they had been writing these very long Sid Barrett songs that were really kind of out of control, and they it's cool, but like I think they called them like psychedelic noodling. They weren't really song structures. They're like fusion. Album actually had ideas that came into like little vignettes that were songs, but they were all connected, and the boards in the recording room, they were all jumping on synthesizers. They're all giving each other comments. They were all working together as a team to make the songs the best they could be. And they had a picture of them all with their hands on the soundboard, actually turning the knobs to get the feel. They're all doing it together, not one guy.
I'd love to
And I
see
thought that
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 documentary.
was fantastic.
Maybe you could, tell us what it was, or I
Yeah,
think I and probably everybody else in the audience would like to watch that.
it's just cool to see that creative process when it's not. Sometimes it's like one or two people, but they have the whole band working together as for when I'm in a band is to get everybody's uh contribution. And like if I came in there with a drum and I have a real drummer, like I'm not gonna stick with my drum beat off of my drum machine. I'm gonna let him write the drum part and I'm gonna give him the writing credit for that and not say that I wrote it, he wrote it. And the bass player take my bass idea and make it better. Keyboard players I'm gonna play board, but yeah, I could write like all the parts.
You know that
But the
so
idea is like even the parts, like you as a demo, you let people come in and just do what they do to make it better.
Yes, and it's almost like a an organism with different systems. So that idea translates into other areas, like so many other ideas and other creativity. It reminds me of the human body. The human body talks to itself. The brain issues chemicals, sends out chemicals and hormones and all kinds of things to activate things in the body. If you get injured, it sends T cells and other things to that area to heal it. And if your blood sugar goes up or down, it it releases some glycogen to take care of that. And just so many things, your cortisol levels higher in the morning to get you up and to get you moving, and then it slows down later, it lessens later in the day, and other things happen to bring you to a point where you can then get your rest. And it's all these systems in your body talking to one another, but in a different form of communication. And so that's creativity too. Just interesting.
Well, you also mentioned like you like to send your work for feedback. You know, because musicians we can get feedback by send it to the band, send it to the recording engineer, send it to the producer. So when you're a writer, you trust your people. They like I guess they call them sometimes like writing groups or like you have this person, you have like people that you trust. Idea
Yes.
is this working? Is it not working? So when did you find that like early in your career, or did you learn it?
I didn't find it early. I didn't. I tried. I looked for writing groups. I had a friend, one of my good friends, came years ago, 30 years ago now, from Moscow to move here. And she's a great writer. And we would try to get together and talk about our writing. But it was always such a struggle. Because we were raising a family, each of us, and working full time. And so it was just difficult that I looked online for a good group. And I lived in the suburbs of New Jersey, and there wasn't all that much going on. I thought about driving into New York City, which is where I went to graduate school, because, oh,
Mm,
New York City, there's always something going on there. And there were good groups there, but it was kind of a slog, there and back. And with everything else I was doing, it wasn't feasible to do. And lo and behold, uh, they say something, uh, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And I don't know if that's exactly right on point here, but when I was
yeah, it's
ready,
something like that.
yeah, when I was ready to do the writing, I got an email from a person who had done a lot of continuing education credits that I had taken. I had to do 40 continuing ed credits every uh, every 2 years for my psychotherapy license, and he was starting a book class to help people get their books written and published. And I really needed help with the publishing part. And it seemed a little daunting at first, but I thought, I'm just going to go for it. And I joined and I never looked back. And this has become my writing group. We meet once a week and online on Zoom, because there's people from all over the world, which is so interesting. And we do breakout groups where we sometimes we read each other our work and we get feedback. And you can get an accountability partner. You can ask somebody to
Mhm.
pair up with you and share your work and have them give you feedback. So that's invaluable, I think. And for any artist and any person who's creative and doing some kind of endeavor, it's really good to get feedback, because I think we all need constructive criticism, people to be honest with us about what we're doing,
Oh yeah,
and people who are wiser, maybe more experienced than we are, to give us that feedback, but also to give us positive feedback, because maybe we don't always expect that. And then to hear something that boosts your morale, boosts your confidence, is just terrific, and can give you that inspiration that you need. That word inspiration, Phantom, is, I think it's Latin, and it's in spiro. That's what it comes. Those are the roots, and that means the spirit within you. And so that inspiration is your
Yeah.
spirit inside. It's that sweet spot that all the channels are running, and you're communicating with, when you're a musician and you're working with other people, or you're a sculptor and you're in a class and you're uh, working with people, or you're a painter and you have a model. There's all kinds of synergy going on, and that's really
Like, yeah.
neat.
It's like interviews. Like I've always used like the external inputs that you get as an artist, but then it's like it is a kind of inspirational thing. Like it's all your a lot of dreams. It's like a lot of times as an artist, like all my stuff here is in my bedroom. These are all my and I have them in my bedroom. It's like a lot of times things come to you as dreams, and if you
Yes,
have the
yes.
tools to actually create art, I can just give up and then jump on one of my boards and actually take something that just came to me
Mhm.
and do it right away. I don't have to wait. I don't have to go and drive to the studio. I can just do it. And a lot of us are setting things up like that. And I know people take like do voice memos and have like notebooks. Do you have that as a writer? Or do you like to use voice memo type thing or pads and just write things down and go back and look at it?
Good question. I know people who use OneNote or voice memos, so it's verbal, and I have done that, and I still have recordings that I've made. Perhaps I was driving home from work, in the evening, and my mind was going, and so I didn't want to lose that, so I would record it. But for the most part, the way I do it is I get a pad and pen and I jot it down. And I do sometimes keep a notebook next to my bed on my night table, because there are times where I wake up and my brain writes without me doing anything. I might be having a dream and I'm writing a story. I am telling a story, and I wake up in the middle of telling the story, and I've got to grab a pen and paper and write it down before I lose it, because it will
Yeah,
go like smoke in the wind if you don't capture it at that time. Uh, so yes, I do that. Uh,
yeah. That's
I
why.
heard I heard a story recently about
That's definitely
just
why I've got one of my big.
sorry. It's
Yeah,
what you were just saying is
we go ahead. Right.
one of some famous musician. I don't remember who it is right now off the top of my head, but it might have been Stairway to Heaven. That whoever
Hmm.
that artist was had a dream, and woke up and actually
Hmm.
played the song
Oh,
and wrote it down.
Robert Plant, maybe. Yeah,
I don't
Jimmy.
remember
That's
who
why I
it
think Jimmy
was.
Page came up with some of those chords. I think, yeah, it was either Jimmy because it's like the big part of it that like the guitar part. So he's the
Hmm.
primary guitar player with Jimmy Page, but Plant had these like ideas for the lyrics are so kind of poetic, but and it's like multiple shift. It's like a shifting progressive song. It goes from like one type of structure to another. It starts off slow and
Yes.
it's typical of progressive rock. Like it's more classical structures where they have like movements and changes, which are complicated, and some music today doesn't have that. Kind of
Mhm.
stays into beat focused, where the old music would have traditional song structures like intros. They'll have like the melody, like a second a variation on the melody, like changes. They have different structures. Where a lot of people today just like, oh, I'll just get a beat focused, kind of dance focused changes. And more interesting in the '70s, you get bands like the Carpenters and the Beatles. There's lots of key changes, and there's all kinds of structural changes that make it more interesting. Like you have like shadowing of like things that are going to happen, like little snippets. It's like more interesting, and instead of going this straight sequential order that you kind of play with your timeline, you move things around. Musicians kind of like to play with our timelines too.
That's really interesting to hear you talk about it in that way. I think you and I were lucky because we grew up with all that classic rock being created at that time, and that was our music.
Hmm.
Even today, so I have grown kids, and my son is he's not a professional musician. He doesn't That's not what he does for a living, but he has been playing the guitar for 32 years, I think. And he's
Hmm.
played he played the Stone Pony in Asbury Park, where Bruce Springsteen rose to fame, and
So
has played a number of places. Very fun, very fun. I think that he really loves all that music still. And our other son, who's not a musician, but he said to me one day, we were actually in the gym working out, and he said to me, "Who's your favorite rock band?" Because of course we were listening to music, and I was like, "Oh, how do you have a favorite rock band?" So I thought about it and thought about it, and I gave him an answer. I don't even know if who I said it, whether it was Led Zeppelin or something. And he looked at me with a face and he said,
Bones,
My favorite
or Pink
is the
Floyd.
Beatles." And I'm like, the Beatles are a class of their
Well,
own.
they're like the classic of everybody's like. Well, they're like the beginning of the age of the album. And it's
Mm.
so important that you don't have a Pink Floyd without the Beatles because the music prior to that was not album focused. One of the things
Wow.
about it, like if you go in the '50s and the '40s focused, and then people would take songs and put them into collections, and sometimes they would become albums, but they really weren't well thought out structurally until you get like the Beatles actually start creating using it as a form to tell stories. Like Sergeant Pepper isn't exactly a story, but it's like if they it all makes sense. And then the idea is that you don't just listen to that one song at a time. People tend to listen to Sergeant Pepper's all the way through. So it's the idea, and it opened it up for bands like Pink Floyd to say, yeah, we can do like Wish We Were Here, or we can do these big kind of concepts, the Who with Tommy. The idea that you can tell a story with not just one
Right,
song, but multiple songs
right.
strung together.
There's so many good
Achievement
examples
really
of that.
caused a lot of bands in the '70s. Like that's what the age of the album. You see from the late '60s into the '70s, like that kind of effort. But
I I
Chris,
never knew that before. Thank you for pointing that out. Never even crossed my mind, but you're right. I remember being a little kid and having the little tiny little records that I would keep in a little box. And it wasn't until, as you're
yeah, the
saying,
45s. Yeah,
yes, yes, yes. So funny. Uh, yeah, I never really thought about that before. Um,
we've kind of gone backwards to like the '50s time now. I mean, we're back into a kind of singles focused world, which is like the 1950s. Um, and songs are not the primary thing anymore. People would listen to individual songs more, but I'm always hopeful that there are artists that are so powerful that they get people to listen to a whole thought. Like a
mhm,
Taylor Swift will get people to listen to the whole thing. Like a Peter Gabriel, he'll usually get people to listen to his whole. Uh, those level artists will come in and people will say, "Oh yeah, I do. I'm going to listen to Kendrick Lamar's whole because it's a full vision." And it's kind of like I always felt like musicians can be like authors. They are short stories that tell stories are connected, and a lot of times I used to read a lot of Stephen King, and I used to read like epic poetry, like the Odyssey and the Iliad and Shakespeare, because it would tell a story, and it's kind of cool if you structure your records in terms of like, oh, I want to make it, or I want to make it like William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. I want to tie it together. I want to take an idea and tie it together.
It's fascinating to think of it that way. Some albums are a collection of short stories. They're similar, and then others tell they're chapters instead, and they tell the whole. You have to listen to the whole album
Mhm. Yeah.
to hear the story. For instance, can you imagine cutting up Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon and only listening to one of the songs? How can you listen? Have you ever been listening
Yeah, you won't,
years ago to the radio and somebody
won't work.
plays Time and they don't play Home Again? Ticking away the hours that make up a dull day, and
Yeah,
then you
it's
and
kind
then
of
you get to the
ridiculous.
end, and you have to hear Home Again, and then they cut it off. It just doesn't work.
The other, you need to hear the, yeah, it doesn't work. But yeah, I mean, that whole idea of being able to do that, even when you listen to like Tapestry, famous 70s album, it's not a concept album, but every song kind of flows where it still feels like it's a complete thought. And so that was the cool thing, even though, like Yellow Brick Road from like Elton John, it's not a concept album, but the songs all work together. It feels a complete thought, even though it's got different variations. It's not like a Pink Floyd album. It's not Tommy. Still a complete. It's just different variations that it seems to feel. And I've always been like very interested in the albums that are connected like that, not as tightly connected, but still feel like a full picture.
I am
It's kind of
impressed
sweet
with
spot.
with I'm impressed with the amount of knowledge you have and how you talk about all kinds of different songs and collections of songs and albums, and as examples of all these things, and your literary awareness too, and the parallels that you draw between the literature and the music. And I think that is instructive for all of us. I think it gives us all something to think about. Phantom, I have a question for you. So, I'm an older person.
Mhm.
When I was an elementary school student, I learned to play the trumpet, and I also then my music instructor started having me play the French horn and wanted me to start playing the piano. And then I had to get braces, and I because of whatever was being done, I had to stop playing the piano or the trumpet for a while, and I never took it back up full time. I certainly
Oh,
have played it,
got back to
but I really would like to either take up piano or the violin. So, can you teach an old dog new tricks as far as learning uh, um, a musical instrument? What do you think?
another instrument. Yeah. Well, I started on a woodwind. I started on a clarinet, and then I realized that it's not the best writing instrument, and so I went to the keyboard. Well, I went to guitar and I couldn't get it. I wanted it. I wanted to get it, but my brother, he immediately got on the guitar. My younger brother, and he could just do it. I'm like, wow. And I was struggling because I figured when I knew how to read music, I said, well, I'll be able to figure it out. And I just didn't have the feel for the guitar, but I had the feel for a keyboard. Synthesizers and electrons and pianos, and then somehow I felt more natural on that. So I think a lot of times, like, there's a lot of people who can play multiple instruments. My brother can play bass, he can play guitar, can play
But
drum.
all
You
string
can kind of
instruments.
how much you want to be dedicated.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
how
string
much?
instruments are easy to kind of cross over. You can go from, yeah, they're easier to cross. If you know one, you can get to the next one.
But you said something before that about, how do you know what instrument is right for you, or do you just try them?
I tried the drums and I wasn't good at it. I tried guitar, I wasn't good at it. I jumped on the keyboard and then I felt natural on it. And I just wow, it's like I can actually do that. And then I just went whole hog into it. And I still like my wood that I can actually do woodwind type stuff with the reed because there's some things that you learn on a woodwind that are so interesting that like on flutes and saxes and clarinets that those instruments are really once you learn how to trill and you learn how to use your reed and the you the breath control being that type of instrument is very unique because you can have to physically have a limitation as a human, but you can breathe, right? So you have to have that informant. Um, the breath control, what you physically can do as a human with holding your breath when you play a wind instrument. If you're on a string instrument, you don't have to do that. You know, it
Mhm.
has nothing to do with the breath control. It's
Makes
your
sense.
dexterity, but you keep on going on and on and on the keyboard too. Yeah, so you have if you're ever on a synthesizer and you're trying to play a flute, you have to remember that if you play a flute, there has to be the physical flute player is going to have breaths being taken. And if you just endlessly play, you're never going to match what a real flute sounds like.
Mm, mhm, mhm. Wow, thanks. And if anybody in the audience is out there wondering whether they should take up an instrument, I would say yes, because there are times that our heart needs to speak in a way that maybe our mouths cannot do. And if you're, I've been envying musicians for a long time who can just sit down and let their heart spill out onto a keyboard or out through their violin or whatever that instrument is. That's an enviable uh, practice and an enviable talent to have. So if anybody's listening, go for it.
Yeah, I'm kind of a part of this is that I can replicate. I can actually go and like try to play like an or I can go try to play like a violin, and my synthesizer can do behavioral modeling, which means like a wind instrument, it will have like breath articulation through certain controls with foot pedal where I can replicate the behavior. Kind of like being a big in an orchestra, you can play all the different instruments, but you have to learn the style of those instruments. So, so that it seems like so a really cool way to find out what you'd be into. If you get into a synth and you're like, okay, I'm gonna learn how to play bass, bass, but you have to think about what would a bass player really do versus what a keyboard physically does, and you have to learn different techniques to kind of mirror what you could do physically on a bass. And then you could say, well, yeah, that means I really, or I really dig the way violins are. I'm going to actually go learn that. And it kind of
Mhm,
gives you a choice to like hear different things and then try different
mhm.
techniques. And then you can decide, I want to move on to the real instrument to get that feel.
And so this is a way to discover what your talents are, which is part of the purpose of our life, right? We were talking about purposeful living and finding your purpose, living a purposeful life. And one of the things that I tell people who ask me about how to find what your purpose is to ask yourself, "Well, what are you good at? What talent do you have? If you don't know, what do people tell you you're good at? And then when you identify that, how can you use that to improve your life, your family's life, the life of your community, and the life of the world?" And we've been talking about creativity as far as
Yeah.
music and literature, um, and any kind of artistry, but there's all kinds of creativity. I use a fitness app, the Kira Stokes fitness app, and it's just interesting to see this kind of thread move into other areas, that idea of telling a story. And she has a
Mhm.
library of videos, workout videos, and she talks about how every movement is a chapter in the story of a workout. and she
It's a dance.
um,
It's kind of like fitness to be like a dance. Dancing
a,
tells a
a
story too.
dance, and it tells a
You
story,
know,
and it stacks one thing on top of another for your physical self, and so that tells a story. And so if you're looking for your purpose, which is a good idea, because living a meaningful life and a fulfilling life, it will happen if you know what your purpose is and if you're living your purpose. Um, there's something called the Blue Zones Project. I'm a real fan of it. It uh, has isolated 9 different ways in which people generally live to over 100. There are 7 pockets in the world where people naturally live that long, and it's because of the way they live. And National Geographic first highlighted them, found
mm,
them, interviewed them, and photographed them back in the 1980s, I think, and the photographer for that project made it his life's work, which is just fascinating. And so you can just look up the Blue Zones Project, and one of the
that's really
9
awesome.
tenets of the of living that long and is knowing your project, your purpose, and that actually helps you live longer and a happier life. So just a neat idea.
What I find is that I like to do is like we a lot of times you have your career, you have your professional career, and sometimes that's satisfying for people that that's what they do, that's who they are. But like art to me is my art, whether I make money on it or not. I'm a musician not because I want to make money. I'm a musician because I love music, and so I love everything about it, and I do it, and it happens to make me money because I think if you love what you're doing, things just happen. Things just like fall into place. It's not that I'm trying to make money with it. I'm just being satisfied with the feeling it gives me. And I think a lot of artists will say that, they're like the starving artist kind of idea. Well, I'm just going to do it because I love art. And then you have to find ways to monetize the way the world is, but maybe you don't, because a lot of artists like William Blake was never famous in his time. The Velvet Underground weren't famous in their time. There's a lot of artists that are very significant, but they didn't make just because they weren't charting. That doesn't mean they weren't significant to the can. A lot of examples that cross like William Blake and poetry. Lou Reed initially wasn't really well understood and then became very well understood. So I think people shouldn't be afraid or judge themselves because they're not hitting the top 10 on anything. Like everybody
Mhm.
has these ways to measure people. It doesn't necessarily that isn't valuable. Just because you're not hitting the top 10 doesn't mean what you're doing is not valuable or not
That's not
important.
the only way, not the only way to measure success. And you are so right. You are so right. I hope people take that to heart. It's a great message.
As I always try to tell people, like when I'm working with them, it's like, just because this song maybe doesn't hit the way you want to, don't give up, don't stop. And I've run into people who have stopped because they didn't hit their goal. And my whole point is that as a musician, like most of your songs are not going to hit. Even when you're big musicians, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of songs that didn't go anywhere. And if you stop because one of those didn't go, you never get any. You never think that's with anything in life. You have to have failures to get better. And those failures aren't actually failures. They're actually like steps in the rung for you to get where you're going.
One of my favorite sayings these days, Phantom, is everything feels like a failure in the middle, especially if you're looking to make money or have a lot of fame or something like that. Uh, just because you're not finished with it, just because you haven't gotten to what you think is your goal, doesn't mean you're a failure. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And look at Babe Ruth. That's such a great example. That guy just kept swinging the bat, and he swung and struck out a lot of times, but he just kept swinging that bat, and that's how he became
Yeah.
successful.
Yeah, I mean, do tell people like you. A lot of times, artists aren't good judges of what is actually going to work. And I always tell people like you, if you have 100 songs and then you pick one out of those 100 songs, the chances of the one that you pick the audience actually liking is probably not good because
Mhm.
most artists don't pick the song even in their own catalog. So in today's world, with TikTok and Reels and Shorts and all these different media outlets, it's actually better to throw it at the wall and see what the fans actually like than
Mhm.
to try to prejudge it because you have a lot of opportunities to put a lot of material out. The record companies maybe wouldn't let you do that. And it's probably the same thing like when you're self-publishing. You're able to put your idea out probably a lot quicker than having to go to the committee and get it edited and do that. You have the opportunity to put your idea you want to. You shouldn't be afraid to do that. That's what I always tell people.
And taking that again into a different arena, when you're a psychotherapist, you cannot judge the effectiveness of a psychotherapy session on the way that you, the psychotherapist, feels. You may think you had a great session, and maybe your client walked away thinking it was terrible. And on the other hand, you might have thought the session was terrible or kind of bland or went nowhere. And you find out that your client made a breakthrough because of it. And so you cannot judge, as you said, you can't judge for yourself. You have to have that feedback from your fan base.
Yeah, and it's really good today with all these different forms that you can put out your demos, like on SoundCloud. You can put out ideas like on Facebook. You put things something out like you're on YouTube and then see if a one act play if it works. You can do it. You so people can put their art into different places and see if it actually. And there's so many people who kick from social media that came out of nowhere. The normal gates, no matter what type of artist they were, would never let them in. And they had the gumption. It was like a millions, and you're like, it comes out of left field, and they don't really hit. No one was really pushing them. They just actually hit that note. They hit that universal key. No matter what type of
Mhm.
thing you do, you can hit that key, and then it triggers. But if you never pull the trigger to put that key out there, no one's ever going to find it.
Right, right. So don't be that person. Put
That's
yourself
my
out there.
lesson learned.
Yes, very good.
So we have hit our time kind of great, but I do want to mention your website below because for the people who don't have the visual of this, there's www.janewesler.com. So what will people find there if they go to that website?
People will find my story. They'll find resources for help if you need help in any way emotionally, or I'm a coach and I am a writer, so my books are all listed
Life
there.
coach.
You can. I'm a life coach at this point, and I help particularly women who are struggling with bone issues. It's just become a
Mhm.
sub significant group for me, and so there are resources there for help and assistance, and people can make an appointment with me for one-to-one coaching. And you'll also find connection with my Facebook group, my Jayne Wesler author Facebook group, and other groups that I run to help people.
That's awesome because you did write something about your be able to get over osteoporosis without medication.
Yes, I have 3 books, about how to strengthen your bones, make them strong, and increase your bone density. It's a pet subject of mine because people don't have to take medication, but unfortunately, that's what they're often told, and medication has a lot of risks and not a whole lot
You probably won't.
of
Yeah,
effectiveness. Thank you.
benefits. Well, you see that on the TV ads all the time. So I think what you had reversing osteoporosis and osteoporosis without medication, evidence-based interventions, just to mention those. Um,
Yep,
Yeah, I
that one.
think that's a really cool thing. There it is. Yeah, that's awesome.
And this
Yeah,
is the
well, it's
first book.
always good to show to people. So that one was that's the first book like that. Oh, No Bones.
Yeah.
Okay, that one I
No,
didn't
no
have
bones
written
about it.
down.
Increase your bone
But
density without medication. That's the story of how I did it. And then because I'm an attorney and this is it's not a one and done, you have to keep working at it. I wrote about evidence-based interventions, what actually works. Because as an attorney, I want the evidence.
that's
And
awesome.
then I was grappling with at one point, am I really eating right? And so I wrote Feed Your Bones, a nutritional workbook
Feed your
for
bones.
increased bone density and bone strength. So, and those are on Amazon and
That's cool. Like
but they can be found on my bookshelf on my website.
that's cool. So if you go to their website, you can check out all those books, and it's a very holistic vision. It seems like you probably should get all of them. If you once you get one of them, you should look at the whole picture because you're looking at the whole
Mm.
holistic everything things like that getting done. A lot of things is like it's holistic. You have to look at the whole your spirit, your body, your mind. It's like is this out
Yes,
like you not just one, you know.
you're right. It's like we were talking
But
about.
thank you
It's
again for being on the program.
my great pleasure. Thanks for having me, Phantom. I really enjoyed all the synergy that we had, and I hope the audience will take that and use that and find their own sweet spots.
Very, very formally talking about, and I think I like to try to bring together disparate concepts that I still think connected. And so, that's what I try to do. But thank you for being on the program tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.